Okay, and that was one of the most famous psychedelic rock songs of all time. That's Comfortably Numb from Pink Floyd. And the reason I chose this song is because we're talking about consciousness. And one of the great mysteries of consciousness is exactly what it is and why we have it and how it works. So that's not one. That's actually the problem is that almost everything about consciousness we still have left to learn. Yeah, we understand the basic workings of our neurons and of the circuits in our brain and that sort of thing, but we don't quite understand how they all function together to produce consciousness. So we're going to talk about some interesting aspects of consciousness today, and let's take a look at an overview. So we're going to talk about defining consciousness, right? And, there are some basic ideas and issues here. We've got the notion that we all have this sense that we're in our own movie, kind of, right? We have a sense that, there's that we're experiencing the world. We're watching the world from our vantage point, yeah. But we also know that the other people in the world are doing the same thing, or at least that's our guess, right? Is that most people experience the same things when we talk about consciousness. So we're going to talk about that, and then we'll talk about the various aspects of consciousness, such as the experiences, visual perception. We'll talk about consciousness and memory, body awareness, decision making. And then we'll wrap it up with some discussion about understanding consciousness, some evolutionary stuff, and the functions of consciousness as well. Yeah. Next thing we have is about a 10-minute video on just an introduction to consciousness. So why don't we get started with that?
It is the most fundamental experience of all, defining our waking moments and giving rise to all that we think and feel. Without consciousness, we have no way of proving we or anything else exists. And yet, what it is and why we have it remain a mystery that some of the greatest minds have been unable to solve.
The only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. I wake up in the dark of a hotel room. I'm discombobulated because I'm jet lagged. I have no idea where I am, or even who I am, or in what country I am, yet I know I exist because I see something.
Rapid advances in our understanding of how the brain works might one day allow us to pinpoint the parts of the brain that generate consciousness. But will something as objective as science be able to explain what it feels like to be us?
Consciousness by its nature is private. It's subjective. I know about my consciousness from the first person point of view. Other people can only know about my consciousness very indirectly.
Philosophers have been trying to answer some of these questions for millennia. In the past couple of centuries, scientists have joined them. Debate can be fierce. In fact, some scholars reckon the puzzle of consciousness is something the human mind is incapable of solving.
I think that's not just wrong, I think it's culpably wrong. It isn't impossible at all. It's just that we have to buckle down and do it.
One thing that both disciplines can agree on is that consciousness arises in the brain. Made up of roughly 85 billion neurons and other supporting cells about which we know little, the brain consumes almost 20% of our energy, despite comprising just 2% of our mass.
Every so often I get kind of interested in astronomy and cosmology because you look out there and you think, oh gosh, this is amazing, it's almost limitless. But then I turn around and I kind of introspectively think about the brain, and it's kind of like a universe within. We're a long ways of understanding how it works, but if we could get down to figuring out how a neuron works, by God, then we could deal with it 2 neurons, and then 4 neurons, and then 4 million neurons, and then 100 million.
Helped by developments in imaging, partly pioneered by Dr. Reichel and his team, scientists can study in some detail the 2 enormous folded sheets of outer brain called the cerebral cortex. This plays a crucial role in higher brain functions like memory, perception, thought, and language.
And I have 2 of them in my left and right. And it's part of this sheet that gives rise to consciousness. This sheet also gives rise to intelligence and reasoning and all the other things that we hold dear about the human brain and the human mind.
Christoph Koch wants to come up with a satisfactory scientific theory of consciousness before he dies.
Science wants to explain everything. If science fails to explain the central fact of my existence, I would say then it's a failure.
In order to gain a better understanding of how parts of the brain work, scientists often look at bits of it that are broken.
There is a little part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is at the back of my brain. If I lose it, I will be unable to, let's say, to dance or be a rock climber, and I have difficulty moving. My speech becomes slurred, but my consciousness will not be impaired.
On the flip side, it seems that some parts of the brain may be essential for consciousness. Identifying these so-called neural correlates of consciousness would help pin down what is happening.
What might the NCC, the neural correlate of consciousness, be like? Assuming that it's an emergent neuroscientific process. And let me say straight away that we don't know what it's like.
Before his death in 2004, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, worked with Dr. Koch on something they termed the binding problem. Put simply, the binding problem asks how the brain integrates different bits of information it gets, both sensory and internal, into our conscious experience.
In real life, the brain is terribly good and puts everything together, the movement, the shape, and the color. The usual way of saying the binding problem is if you have a red square and a green triangle. How is it that you don't see it as get the colors mixed up with the shapes? That's basically the problem.
Because our experience of consciousness is derived from the data we get from lots of different systems, the visual and motor being just 2, the 2 men looked at a part of the brain that is connected to all these regions. They were especially interested in the claustrum, a thin sheet of nerve cells that sits at the bottom of the cerebral cortex in each hemisphere of the brain. Because testing the claustrum in a live human brain is invasive and risky, no formal experiments have been done. But one happened accidentally last year when a neurologist trying to understand the source of his patient's epilepsy implanted electrodes near her claustra. When he switched the current on, she lost consciousness. As soon as he switched it off, she regained it.
No one knows why we have consciousness. It's one of the big mysteries. Why did evolution bother putting consciousness in? How did evolution put consciousness in? Why couldn't we have done everything that we do with a set of objective mechanisms and no first-person subjective experience of the world? It's one of the biggest questions in philosophy and science.
Just as the processes of consciousness remain a mystery, so does its purpose. Is it a high-level summary the brain generates to help us plan for what comes next? A clever way of designing our brains to make us more adept at being social? Neither? Both? One evolutionary explanation for why we have consciousness suggests that an animal capable of modeling the behavior of another can anticipate it to its advantage.
The surprising thing is that so few animals actually have this ability. Humans have it. So I have a very good idea of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it and why you're going to do it. And children starting at maybe around 3 years old get that.
Janet Metcalf studies something called the theory of mind.
Theory of mind is actually a misnomer. The way we test it is whether a person or an animal can give evidence that they can get into the other person's shoes or the other person's mind and see the world from that person's perspective. Now, the test of it is often not just can you see from the viewpoint of the other person, but could you see that someone has a different viewpoint from your own?
The theory of mind might provide one way of working out if animals other than humans are conscious.
The only species that we're absolutely sure has theory of mind is human. And maybe humans older than roughly 3 years old. It's very controversial whether any other animals have it. They're arguing about whether chimps have theory of mind or not.
Before we can have a theory of mind, we must recognize ourselves. For decades, scientists have used something called the Rouge test to see whether animals do just that. Human babies do from about 18 months old. Chimpanzees, presented with mirrors, soon use them to groom themselves, much as we do. Elephants, dolphins, and magpies also can respond to mirrors in ways that suggest self-recognition.
The problem with the Rouge test that the animal researchers always raise is that maybe it's just body knowledge, that it's not mind knowledge. So it was interpreted as the animal knowing that they have a mind, and theory of mind as we normally think about it is related to another person, not to the self. But presumably you have to know that you have a mind before you project that same capability onto someone else.
Identifying the neural correlates of self-recognition in animals would be a hard task. But if we were able to do it, comparative studies would be possible. That would be hugely valuable. Science is edging closer to understanding what parts of the brain might be involved in generating conscious experience. By some estimates, we may not be far away from an empirically sound theory of consciousness and how it evolved. But could a physical theory ever satisfactorily address what it is that people are feeling when they are conscious? David Chalmers calls consciousness the hard problem, a deft description for something that is hard to explain and hard to solve.
The methods of science right now are great for explaining objective processes and objective functions. So when it comes even to explaining things like the behavior of an organism, you can tell some story about a bit of the brain, a neural process or a computer-like process in the brain that makes us behave a certain way. But the problem of consciousness, what we call the hard problem of consciousness, which is explaining how you get subjective experience from the brain, is not that kind of question. It's not a question about how we behave. It's a question about what it's like, about how it feels from the inside. And it looks like you can explain all those objective mechanisms and objective processes, and you still won't have answered the hard problem, which is why is it that all that functioning is accompanied by consciousness?
The hard problem divides philosophers and scientists alike. Some philosophers argue that consciousness can be explained far more simply.
A lot of puzzles, no mysteries. We're going to understand it from the bottom up and from the top down. I have no doubt about that.
Daniel Dennett argues that consciousness is nothing more than a cognitive illusion that science will, in due course, explain.
Our brains have been designed by evolution and then redesigned by cultural evolution to give us a user-friendly system of things in the world that we deal with. So the user-friendly world that we live in, the manifest image, is a sort of friendly user illusion in the same way that the desktop of your laptop is a user illusion. It simplifies and it distorts in helpful ways for most purposes. If you really want to know what's going on, you have to go backstage. And the same thing is true about the brain and consciousness. Until recently, we didn't have very good tools for doing it. The brain was just off limits as distant galaxies. We're now developing the tools for non-invasively studying the brain, and we're now developing the computational ideas and models so that we can understand how a brain can non-miraculously deal with information and refine it and uncover the semantics of the world outside and inside. So we now have the toolkit, and it's taken this long to develop it. Now we just have to use the tools.
Perhaps. But for the time being, the puzzle of consciousness continues to pose more questions than it does answers. Yet another philosopher, Protagoras of Abdera, proclaimed that man is the measure of all things. Until the problem of consciousness is solved, though, that might better be phrased, the measure of all things but himself.
Okay, and so that's just your brief, basic sort of introduction to some of the major issues in consciousness. Yeah, let's take a look at the next slide here. Okay, so when we're trying to understand what exactly we mean by the word consciousness, right? Your textbook boils it down to saying that consciousness is first-person experience of an event, and this can include memories and emotions, right? So when they're saying experiences of an event, it can also include our memories of the event, right? When we're experiencing a memory, we're assumed to be conscious, yeah. When we're experiencing emotions, we're assumed to be conscious, yeah. So this definition basically, and the term consciousness refers to our ability to experience a temporal sequence of autobiographical events. And what does that mean? Temporal means time, right? It means that one thing happens before the next thing happens, right? I open my car door, I sit in my car seat, I turn on my car's ignition, and I drive my car. This is a temporal sequence, yeah, that I cannot drive my car without first getting in. I cannot drive my car without turning on the ignition, right? There are things that have to happen in order, and that's this notion of temporal sequence. So we all have a temporal sequence in our head, right? We all experience time in the same way, it appears, yeah. And but all of our experiences, all of the events that we witness and take part in and all that kind of thing are all subjective, yeah. That's the difficulty with doing things objectively is that you know, we aren't set up to do that. We aren't set up to set aside our own personal needs and goals and wishes and dreams to try and look at something without those aspects influencing our observation and what we're thinking about. Yeah. So so the idea of being objective is one that that philosophy still really struggles with. Yeah. Consciousness includes not just our experience, right? It also includes things like our emotions, yeah, anger and joy and fear and all that other good stuff, yeah, are all integral to the conscious experience, right? We also know that our consciousness allows us to use our imagination. And what does that mean? We can imagine something in our heads that we've never seen, yeah. If we want to imagine, for example, a spaceship, and we want to imagine that this spaceship, you know, whatever shape it is, whatever color it is, we can do that, right? We can do a spaceship that's very, very tiny, that's the size of a grain of sand. We can imagine that. We can imagine a giant spaceship that's the size of the planet or even more, right? So we have this ability to manipulate ideas and images inside of our head, right? And that's sort of that notion of we can create things that we've never experienced before, yeah? And that's one of those amazing things about consciousness, because we can't say that consciousness is just what we learn and being able to repeat what we learn, yeah? So when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about memories, emotions, imagination, all that stuff. One of the key aspects of consciousness that we all experience is our self-concept, yeah? And what that means is each one of us has an experience that we are single, yeah? That, you know, my name is Kanoa Merriweather. I have skin around my body that separates my body from the rest of the environment and the rest of the world. I am not part of someone else, right? You know, I may be married, which, you know, we're in a union and all that other stuff, but we are not linked in a conscious way, right? We don't share a bloodstream. We don't share, you know, our thought processes and those sorts of things. What I think and what I feel is unique to me, right? I cannot then say that other people think or feel the same way that I do. Yeah. So we have this sense of being separate from other people, right? That we're experiencing a continuity through time as well as place. Yeah, we were born in a certain place. We have early memories. We remember, you know, birthdays. We remember important dates in our experience and that sort of thing. And we're going through time. Yeah, and this is our self-concept that is going through time. Who we are. Are we, you know, are we moral people? Are we, you know, just people? Are we people who are friendly? Are we, you know, confrontational? Whatever we are, right? This whole idea of what makes me me is very different from what you think about and what makes you you, right? So when we talk about the experience of the self, we're also talking about our awareness and our consciousness of our physicality, as well as all that inner character and emotional life, right? And when I say our physicality, you know, our physical body, right? And of course, you know, in the previous lecture, we talked about how we can be fooled, right? The rubber hand experiment, for example, or, you know, the phantom limb, yeah. So we know that our consciousness isn't 100% accurate all the time, yeah? But we do have a sense for our physicality. We have a sense for where our body is in the world, right? In our environment. And we also have a sense for what our body is capable of, right? Some folks are extremely athletic. They can run very fast, or they can run very far, yeah? And other folks can't, right? And we have a sense for that. You know, someone who chain smokes cigarettes every day and, you know, is 100 pounds overweight and stuff is under no illusions that they're going to run a marathon, right? That's sort of that idea, yeah? Okay, so when we talk about consciousness, part of it is also including the individual's state of mind and their capacity for what's called intentionality, yeah? So, for example, someone who's comatose is not capable of being intentional, right? The idea is that someone who's comatose and cannot then interact with the world and that sort of thing, they're not, you know, say if their hand, you know, because of gravity or whatever, falls off of the bed, right? Their arm falls off of the bed, that they're, you know, their hospital bed or whatever. We don't assume that they did that on purpose, yeah? That's what intentionality is. Intentionality is the notion that people behave in ways in order to achieve certain goals. Yeah. So when we talk about someone, or we talk about the notion of consciousness, we're including the idea that there are different states of consciousness, right? Being asleep isn't being unconscious. It's a different state of consciousness, right? And that's different from being comatose or unconscious. Yeah. We can also talk about, you know, an individual state in terms of their emotions, such as anger, right? Sometimes folks will say, you know, geez, I was just so angry, I didn't stop and think. Yeah, I just got carried away, and I did something that I would not have done in a different context. Yeah. Same thing goes with drugs, right? People can use drugs and experience, you know, activation. They can experience sedation. They can experience euphoria. They can experience hallucinations and such, right? But we can also consider meditation a form of altered consciousness, yeah. And you know, one of the things that meditation teaches us is that we can develop our ability to meditate and to, I don't want to say control our mind, but to have more influence over our mind, over what we think about and how we think and how quickly we react and those sorts of things, yeah. So we know that we can train ourselves. It's not easy, but we can train ourselves, and we can develop a much closer relationship, for example, with our body processes and things like that. When you look at what, you know, yogis can do in India and, you know, some Buddhist temples and such in Nepal, you know, like there's one There's one group who, what they'll do is they'll meditate on being hot, right? And this is in Nepal where it's freezing cold. They'll take sheets and dip them in water. So ice cold water, right? And a sheet that's dripping wet. They'll wrap themselves in that sheet and they'll meditate on warmth, and the sheet will dry. Yeah. Now it's not in 5 minutes or whatever. Yeah. But what they're doing is they're actually raising their body temperature, and they're interacting with that sheet in a way that you and I cannot, because we haven't trained ourselves to do that. Yeah. But they're able to raise their body temperature. Some folks through meditation can change their heart rate, can change their need for oxygen and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Bottom line is, though, consciousness is idiosyncratic and personal. Yeah. So again, I mean, what I'm experiencing inside my world, inside my head, is very, unique to me in many cases, right? And it's also personal. It's not something that other people can observe. Yeah. We can observe inner states through outward expressions and gestures and that sort of thing, right? We can get a sense, even without any sound, without the person telling us, if they're happy or they're angry, right? We look at their body posture, we look at their, their actions. Someone who, walks in the room and slams the door and screams out a curse word is probably angry, right? So we can do that, but that doesn't give us any insight into what that experience of anger is like for them. Yeah. So we can't know consciousness from anyone else's inside view, only from our own. Yeah. So, we're sort of stuck with having to guess and say, that there are similar processes, even though, my personal experience is different from anyone else's personal experience. We're stuck sort of guessing that it might be that same, subjective consciousness of what we experience. Yeah. So then your textbook talks about what a conscious experience is, right? It's basically a subjective experience of a mental event. And you notice how it says a mental event. Why not a physical event, right? It's because everything that we see, everything that we hear, everything that we taste and touch and all that other stuff, those were all mental events. Yeah. Why? Because the information has been transduced. Remember, the sensation and perception thing. We're not experiencing the actual flavor of an orange when we eat an orange and the texture of the orange and all that kind of stuff. What we're experiencing are electrical impulses that are giving us a sense for what we're doing, that we're eating an orange and that the orange feels this way and all that other kind of thing, right? But, just like... I hate to be the cliche, but just like the movie The Matrix, yeah. The idea in the Matrix is that we can't tell the difference between the real world and a simulation, yeah. If we're put into a simulation where, like the Matrix, where we think that we are, autonomous beings, right? We wake up in the morning, we shower, we get dressed, we go to work, we play with our friends, whatever, we go to nightclubs, that sort of thing. We go home, we go to sleep. That all these things happen in the physical world, right? But in the Matrix, the idea is that, we can create a simulation of the physical world. And because human beings don't act directly with the physical world, we have this, these sensory systems that bring the information in, transduce it into electrical impulses. Yeah. So as long as we're provided with the right electrical impulses, we won't be able to tell the difference between the real world and the Matrix. Yeah. Which is a kind of a scary thought. Yeah. Consciousness is something that defines our existence and our reality. Yeah. Consciousness is something that gives us this sense that we've existed, for a certain length of time, that we're going to exist in the future. Yeah. That, the experiences that we had in the past have led us to this point where we currently are now. Yeah. And that the things that we do now and today are going to influence our experience in the future, right? So, this is really the majority of what human beings are, is that consciousness, right? And so we may not be seeing it as it actually is. Yeah. Currently, the way that we explain consciousness is as an emergent property of computational activities in the brain. And what does that mean? Well, we can say that, we can identify that the brain fires, neurons fire, things are communicated, processes happen, right? And then people will say, I'm thinking of a sailboat or whatever, and we can image their brain and see activity in the visual cortex and in the association areas and that sort of thing, and we can say, oh, okay, so what they're saying they're doing and what we're picking up in this imaging is the same thing, right? So the idea is that the brain does its computations, it produces, a memory or whatever that may be, and we say, okay, so the places that were active in the brain, that's what consciousness is. Yeah. So we're down to correlation. Yeah. All we can do right now is correlate activity with behavior and experience, right? So we correlate our consciousness with what's happening in the brain. But it doesn't necessarily mean, correlation is not causation. So just because we can see, well, this same area fires every time the person uses language, yeah, that doesn't then mean that that's the only thing that's responsible for language and for our ability to use language. It's just all we can see right now, right? So the spooky thing is that, there's some philosophers who argue that consciousness actually occurs on a subatomic level, yeah, in the quantum universe, not in our classically arranged physical universe that we're used to, right? But when you go down to the subatomic level, we have what we call quantum physics. Quantum physics basically is telling us that the whole rules, the ideas of laws of motion and thermodynamics that we have here from physics, those all break down at that tiny level. Yeah, when you go beyond the atom and you shrink even further down, that things can be in two places at once, right? We have quantum entanglement, where it appears like one photon is linked to another photon, even though we can't see that link, and their distance is miles apart. But when one turns, the other turns. Yeah, when one rolls, the other rolls, and we don't quite understand why that happens. So it'll be interesting to see, if there is a quantum aspect to our consciousness. Yeah. So there are 4 categories for the scientific study of consciousness. Talk about them real quick. The most obvious is our waking state, which is our general category of awareness, right? Just so general consciousness, the fact that the person's not asleep, that they're able to interact with their environment. Yeah. Then we can look at experience. Yeah, and experience is that immediate awareness. Specifically, right in the moment, what you're hearing, what you're feeling, what you're tasting, what you're touching, all that other kind of stuff. Yeah. We can also look at consciousness in terms of the possession of a mental state, right? And we consider, the idea is that people have enduring conditions or qualities of thought, right? So we have enduring beliefs. We may believe in, whatever spiritual beliefs we have. We may have beliefs about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man, what it means to be a Hawaiian, what it means to be a German, whatever. Yeah. And these are called enduring conditions, right? The possession of a mental state means that it's not something that just quickly flashes through our mind, but the idea is that these are the components of our personality, right? So, our desires, our intentions, our hopes, our values, all those things are things that we may not be thinking of at any specific moment, but they're still part of what make us up, right? They're still an aspect of how we function, yeah? And the 4th category is that sense of self, the notion that, you know, I have thoughts and ideas and experiences that are private to me only, and I own those thoughts. Yeah, no one else can see those thoughts. So no one knows, you know, unless I tell them that I was just thinking about Celine Dion, right? Or I was just thinking about whatever, you know, the price of gold. Who cares, right? But that's the thing. I can't look at you and automatically know what you're thinking, just like you can't look at me, right? So that's that privacy part. There's also that notion of ownership of thoughts, and that is that this thought came from me. Yeah, I created this thought. It was generated within me. It didn't come from someone else. Yeah, it didn't come from a spiritual being. It didn't come from a rock or a tree or whatever. Yeah, my brain creates thoughts. The experience that I have and the way that the stories that I tell myself about these experiences and such are all specific and belong to me and not to anyone else. And the same thing goes for you, right? You have your own personal experience. You have your own thoughts, and you own those. Yeah. So we've got some problems with consciousness, right? You know, one of the issues is how do we, you know, we don't see, you know, this subjective experience. We don't have a lobe of subjective experience in our brain. Yeah. We know that our inner life includes emotions and goals and preferences, biases, whatever. Yeah. But we cannot then, you know, there's no neural substrate that we can identify and say, oh, that's where, you know, all your emotions come from. Yeah, we know the amygdala is involved in emotions. We know that the cingulate cortex and limbic system and all that other stuff. Yeah, but we don't have the one-to-one. Well, if you put an electrical charge up against this part of the limbic system, the person's going to experience anger, and if you hit that part, it's going to be sadness or any of that kind of stuff, right? Then that coherent sense of self, yeah, is one that we're struggling with as well. You know, when you look at how the brain processes information, and you know, basically we can understand now that there isn't actually a flow of consistent consciousness among you know, that people experience. What we're experiencing instead is sort of like a stroboscopic consciousness, and that means that at very, very brief intervals, we're actually flashing, yeah, between recognizing our external world and then our internal processing, and then going back and forth, yeah. And so that sense that we have that, you know, I'm me, and I like chocolate ice cream, and I like going to the beach, and I don't like, you know, this kind of music, and I do like that, and all that other stuff. This is what makes me me, that coherent sense of self or oneness. Again, you know, we can't necessarily find the neural substrates for that, yeah. We've gotten close. We've identified something called the default mode network, which appears to be active when we're thinking about ourselves. Yeah, when we're not thinking about other things, when we aren't working on other tasks and things like that, we have this thing called the default mode network that seems to activate. Yeah. Okay. And you'll read an article for this week's discussion that talks about the default mode network and the concept of self and all that kind of stuff. All right, so we've also got the transition from pre-consciousness processes to consciousness. Yeah, how do we get, you know, things that that we aren't necessarily thinking of into our consciousness? Yeah, how do we retrieve a memory, right? Your 20th birthday. Yeah, how do we think back and pull that out? Do we have a calendar in our head? Yeah, and you know, also other things that are preconscious. We have a way of thinking. Yeah, we have, you know, I mean, your textbook sort of calls it a gut instinct or that sort of thing. But really what it is unconscious processing, right? It's not being recognized by the conscious mind, right? So that's where we have terms like, let me sleep on it, right? And, you know, not that the person who came up with that phrase understood what they were saying, but the idea of, I need to roll around with this before I come to a decision, or before I let you know how I feel, or that sort of thing, right? And what that is we may not necessarily be thinking about it consciously, but we are unconsciously, whether you want to call it preconscious, subconscious, whatever. So the idea of taking a day, sleeping on it, that sort of thing. If you've got a momentous decision to make and that sort of thing, it's usually a good idea to give yourself some time. Yeah. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to come to the best decision, right? But allowing yourself that time to let it sink in, to let whatever we have access to in our subconscious roll around with it a little bit is usually a good idea. Yeah. So free will is also a problem of consciousness, right? That your textbook talks about. Do we really have that free will? Or is it really just the function of our brains, right? That make us think that everything we're doing is our choice. Yeah. But maybe it's not our choice. Maybe our brain fires and tells us we're going to think that we want chocolate milk. Yeah. Or, we're going to think that we want to marry that man or marry that woman or whatever it may be. Yeah. The notion of subjective time flow, right? One of the things that we can see with consciousness, if you're ever in, a situation like a car accident or that sort of thing, like I had a slip and fall when I was about 13 years old, and I fell about 30 feet and landed. Well, actually, it wasn't a slip. A staircase gave way, and I fell through the staircase and fell 30 feet and landed flat on my back. And luckily, it was in this old abandoned building, and there were about 2 inches of water on the ground where I landed, and that probably saved me from having a fairly severe head injury, right? But I remember falling, and it felt like it was forever. Yeah, it felt like it took a long time from the period where I realized that I was no longer in control of my body and that sort of thing, to where the impact happened, seemed to stretch out. Yeah. Now, for me, of course, right, that doesn't mean that the time actually slowed down, right? But my subjective experience of time was very different from my two friends who did not fall off the staircase. Yeah. And so we can have that sense of our subjective time flow, right? You can both be waiting for a class to start or whatever, and one of you might, when the class starts, one of you might say, "Thank goodness that was taking forever," and the other one might say, "Wow, that was quick." Yeah. So we have this subjective idea of what time is and how much time has passed and those kinds of things. Another problem of consciousness is our accuracy of the idea of our conscious perceptions portraying the external world. Yeah. So, just give you a sense. We can't see, temperature, right? If you've ever seen that movie, The Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? That monster, the Predator monster, their vision was based on temperature. Yeah, and that's why they were able to see so well at night, because they were able to pick out the hot bodies of the people who were trying to hide from them and stuff. And we don't see the world that way. Yeah, we see the world in terms of light, right? In terms of light being reflected off of different objects and things, and then coming in and being, hitting our retina and transducing and all that other stuff. Yeah. So we know that we can't see in certain ways. We can't see ultraviolet light. Yeah, we also know that there are sounds that we can't hear, right? There are pitches that are too high for us to hear. Dog whistle, right? You blow a dog whistle and the dog will come, but no one else will hear the sound. That doesn't mean that the sound doesn't exist, right? So there might be all kinds of stuff going on in our world that we're unable to pick up on, that we're unable to perceive. Yeah. And then the flip side of that coin is, do we all have similar pictures of what lies outside our conscious minds? What that means is your experience of the color green the same as my experience of the color green? And it's difficult to know, because how do we communicate what that is? Yeah. What do we mean when we say green? Yeah. So like trying to explain a color to someone who's blind, right? There's no real words for it. Because it's all a visual process. It's just something that we see and we know when we see it, right? Because we've learned to put that label on it. Yeah. Another major problem that we have with consciousness is that we can't reproduce consciousness. Yeah. The only way we can reproduce consciousness is to have a baby. Yeah. So, the movies, TV, and stuff, they want us. They keep producing movies and such of conscious robots, right? Like I think AI, artificial intelligence. I want to say that was a Steven Spielberg movie, and it was just so depressing about this little robot kid who had emotion and all that other stuff, and winds up sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Anyway, so we see value in doing that and being able to produce consciousness in machines and such, yeah, but we haven't been able to do it so far. And of course, one of our great fears is, what the heck is that called? Singularity, right? The idea, another Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, the Terminator movies, right? The idea that if machines develop consciousness, will they necessarily remain friendly or neutral towards the people who created them, right? And of course, in the movie The Terminator, no. Once the machine develops consciousness, then it says, well, the greatest threat to it is other people. So it decides to wipe out all the other people on the planet and such, right? It can do its own thing. It can run manufacturing plants to make more robots and all that other stuff, yeah. So, but we can't do that. The best we can come up with is, various simulations that fall very, very short of anything really resembling consciousness. We know when we're talking to a machine, yeah, especially if we're looking at it, yeah. So yeah, we have cars that can kind of drive themselves, sure. We have amazing technology, but we're nowhere near being able to actually reproduce consciousness in any inorganic form. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the history of consciousness. Yeah. So there's two basic sort of views of consciousness, and really, the first one is kind of outmoded. The first one is called dualism. This comes to us from René Descartes. Yeah. Descartes was, one of the smartest men ever to live. Yeah, I mean, you put him up with Newton, put him up with, Einstein and Stephen Hawking and all those kinds of things. So he wanted to develop a math that would work for the English language. Yeah. And part of that was to say, well, how do we determine what's real and what's not, what's true and what's not? Yeah. And so, he thought a lot about consciousness. He thought a lot about, how can we tell, for example, he's one of the first people to come up with the notion of the matrix, right? But what he was saying was, we have, let's imagine that there is an omnipotent being, a God, yeah. And we shouldn't then necessarily imagine that this omnipotent being is necessarily friendly towards us, right? It could be unfriendly. It could not want us to know truth and reality and that sort of thing. And it could create a completely false reality that we couldn't tell the difference of, right? So Descartes said, well, how do I peel all this stuff back and get to the point of where I can start with one fundamental truth about the world, about me, about anything, yeah? And that's where we get his famous saying, cogito ergo sum, and that's Latin for I think, therefore I am, yeah? And what that means basically is he's saying, well, I might just be a figment of the omnipotent being's imagination, right? How do I even know that I exist? And he said, well, I'm contemplating about my existence, yeah, And so I must exist for me in order to contemplate just that basic aspect. Yeah. So cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He starts his new form of thought with that basic axiom. Yeah. Okay. So when he's thinking about consciousness, his basic explanation was that there's two different forms of life. Yeah. And one of them is organic, and that is, our body, right? That is made up of cells, right? And our heart beats, and our feet, our legs move, and we walk, and all that stuff. But he says the body is basically a machine. Yeah. It's just an organic machine, right? But what drives it, the part of us that's aware and alive and all that other stuff, that consciousness, they didn't call it consciousness back then, but that personality, that thing that makes us up, he said, was the soul. Yeah. So he said, we have this meat sack, right? That if you take the soul out, it falls to the ground and is nothing but a pile of bone and meat and hair, and will just disintegrate over time. So the thing within it that drives it, that makes it function, that brings it to life, is our soul. Yeah. And so he equated our soul with consciousness. And which is an interesting idea, right? I mean, we do know that when we die, we lose consciousness, right? Consciousness never comes back. Yeah. But we also know that people can live without consciousness. Yeah. People can be brain dead and still be kept alive, right? So until we're able to measure and define the soul, we've kind of moved away from dualism in general. Other folks, we're talking about psychology, so let's hit the high points. William James was the next gentleman to take on consciousness, and he studied conscious experience back in 1890. He was, he's sort of like the he was sort of like the Edison of psychology back then. Yeah, he was amazingly productive and amazingly insightful. And what he said about consciousness was that consciousness is a flowing stream. Yeah, we can't divide it into its components because it's something that's constantly changing. It's running through us. Yeah. And so, there was a lot of interest in consciousness at the turn of the century, and then that got completely shut down by the work of Pavlov and especially John Watson. John Watson is he is the grandfather of behaviorism. Yeah. And so what they argued was that let's leave Pavlov out of it. But what Watson argued was that we need to avoid consciousness at all costs if we're to explain behavior. Yeah. So we focus on behavior, on what we can see and what we can measure, and we don't even worry about what's going on inside the head. That's what behaviorism was all about. And that worked really well for about 50, 60 years. Yeah. But by the late 60s, the early 1970s, we were seeing that behaviorism had its limits. Yeah. And that, by that point, consciousness is important. It's important for us to understand consciousness. And there was what they call a cognitive revolution in the 1970s. And that basically refers to the idea that we had folks like George Miller, who was looking at memory, right? And what he was seeing was that people seemed to be able to remember roughly about 7 bits of information, plus or minus 2. Some folks can only do 5. Some folks can do 9 pretty reliably, right? But he's measuring something that's measuring consciousness. Yeah, our ability to remember things, that's part of consciousness. And he wasn't even a psychologist. I want to say he was a computer scientist. Yeah, but so we had this period of time, roughly 60 years, after the turn of the century where consciousness wasn't even considered. Yeah, a few people did, but in general, especially psychology, had no interest in consciousness whatsoever. Yeah. But then by the 1970s, we see the cognitive revolution. We start seeing computers and artificial intelligence and, that kind of thing. In 1980, we had the emergence of a new branch of psychology called evolutionary psychology. And this gave us a new insight, a new perspective on consciousness, right? It said consciousness evolved because it has a function. Everything that we are, that we're capable of, that we can do, right, is assumed to be functional to keep us alive. Yeah. So consciousness is some sort of functional, ability, that helps us to survive. And, we'll talk more about that when we get into the evolutionary psychology portion of the course. Right now, our scientific study of consciousness currently relies on what's called reductionism. And reductionism is the idea that we can understand complex things like consciousness by understanding the parts of it that go together to create it, right? So we can understand mental phenomena by explaining how our brain functions. Yeah. So how do we understand what a dream is, or how do we understand, and that's the thing, right? We're able to do really well with things like our sensory system, right? We understand our eyes, we understand the optic nerve and the visual cortex and all that kind of stuff, right? So we can explain that fairly well. But then that doesn't explain why we're able to recreate images in our head and why we're able to create new images that we've never seen before, right? Like, so if I want to imagine Mona Lisa with clown makeup on, or I want to imagine, well, let's not, I don't want to get too crazy, but, you can imagine things that you've never seen before, right? And so, so we can use reductionism to understand some things, but not everything. Let's take a look at what I mean. So when neuroscientists look at the brain while it's functioning, they're looking for brain activity that they assume or can argue is correlated with consciousness, right? So here we see two different scans. The scan on the left is someone who's hearing words being spoken like you're hearing now. The scan on the right is someone who's seeing words without an auditory component, right? So they're just seeing words on the screen, yeah? So we looking at those scans, we see that there's activity in different parts of the brain, right? And so, we want to say, okay, well, when you're hearing words, this is the part of the brain that's important, this is what's responsible for it, and this explains it, yeah? But it doesn't necessarily, right? That's giving us a sense for that information's being processed, yeah? But it doesn't give us a full explanation and doesn't necessarily mean that that is what our consciousness is, yeah? Okay, so this image here is a sort of a nice little allusion to the idea that each one of us has unique and direct knowledge that only we know about ourselves. Yeah. So for each of us, we only have each one of us has that direct knowledge of our own conscious experiences. Yeah. And again, though, we can't. I cannot say that my conscious experience then equates to your conscious experience, right? And that means then that everything we know, everything we experience is from our own personal vantage point, yeah? With our consciousness at the very center of that vantage point. And, we struggle to think about what the world is like outside of that vantage point, yeah? Beyond our subjective experience. And so that notion of our subjective experience, that's that first person perspective, yeah. And so here we have an image where this is a former psychic reading business, and you see it says for lease there, and written on the window there in sort of graffiti scrawl, it says, "Bet you could have predicted that." Yeah, and with the idea being here that we each one of us has our own personal knowledge and that sort of thing, and when someone says that that they have certain abilities and such, then they cannot live up to those abilities. Just like a psychic can be accurate or inaccurate, it doesn't mean that they have psychic power, right? They can look at they can read your palm and say, you're currently a college student or whatever, and oh wow, hey, you're right, but they could have picked that up from the fact that you're wearing a UH West Oahu sweatshirt, or whatever, your book bag, or who knows what, right? So we can infer that people have similar experiences, but we can't know for sure, right? That's that problem with that first person perspective. Okay, and then we talked about visual perception in the previous lecture, and we know that our memory, our everything that we do is so very closely linked and dependent upon our ability to visualize our world around us, right? And so we're aware. The notion of visual perception, we're not aware of everything that's happening in our view, right? Like this picture here, we see a lady in the foreground, and then in the distance there are these things that are sort of blurry, people, obviously, I guess, sitting in chairs, maybe sitting around a table. But our eyes function that way. We can focus in on certain parts of our visual world and not on others. Yeah, we don't pick up everything perfectly all at the same time. And so part of the questions that people have is, what is it that makes us aware of certain things and not others, right? Because we can recognize that we have an experience where I decide I'm going to look at this, right? But then there's also times when, for example, a sudden noise will cause us to turn around and look where that noise came from or whatever, right? Which isn't necessarily volitional, right? We aren't saying, now I'm going to think about turning around to see what that sound was. Yeah, just we do it automatically. Yeah. So your textbook talks a little bit about motion-induced blindness. There's an interesting little experiment that you can do in the back of the chapter and under the outside resources. You can take a look at that. But I wanted to move on to blindness, and cortical blindness and blind sight. All right, so cortical blindness is what happens when people still have their visual system, but they have damage to the visual cortex, right? So we understand that our ability to see is based in large part on our visual system, right? But we can actually have the ability to see without the conscious awareness of sight, and that's what blind sight is, right? And this is basically where people have damage to their visual cortex, their eyes, and their the main nerve and stuff still works, right? But the cortex is damaged, usually by stroke or injury or that kind of thing. And so these folks may not know it, right? You might ask them, is there something in front of you? And they can't say what it is, or if there is something in front of them. But if you ask them, can you guess which side of your body I'm holding a red plate next to? Yeah. People with cortical blindness with blind sight typically guess correct. Yeah, way more than chance, right? Okay, so we're gonna take a look at a video of a gentleman who has blind sight. We're also going to be hearing from one of the leading neuroscientists of our generation, V.S. Ramachandran, And so this is a really valuable video. So let's get into it.
But Ramachandran has come across an even stranger condition. A remarkable ability of the brain that allows you to see even though you are totally blind. This rare condition is called blind sight. Ramachandran found Graham Young in Oxford, England. He is one of the world's few known blind sight patients. This paradoxical condition shows just how much our brains run our lives without our being aware of it.
Well, when I was 8, when I had the accident, it was a road accident that caused the brain damage, I literally used to walk into lampposts. I ran into, you know, these huge great pillars you get in stations? I ran into one of those one day.
The main visual centers in humans occupy nearly half the brain, in a large region towards the back of the head. Graham's vision was devastated by the accident. Today, he can see to the left, but is blind to everything on the right, in both eyes.
If you put an object in that part of the field and ask him what is it, he has no idea. He cannot perceive it consciously. And yet the remarkable thing is, if you move this object, he will tell you which direction it's moving, even though he cannot see the object.
You can see things over here.
Oh yes, I can see.
I'm going to move my hand across. You tell me when it appears, when it comes into view.
Now.
Very precisely as it enters the seeing part of your field.
Yeah.
And if I just hold over here and you look there, you can't see anything?
No.
How about now?
You're moving it up and down.
But you're seeing it.
It's very easy for me to say to you, oh, I saw that move up, Colin. And as soon as I say that, you're going to say, ah, he can see. No, I can't.
A hypothesis.
Colin Blakemore is an Oxford scientist for whom Graham's mysterious abilities raise intriguing questions about consciousness.
I mean, blind sight is extraordinary when you see it. It's shocking. I think it's shocking because it brings home the fact that we can actually manage our brains without consciousness to some extent. And that leads to the question, well then,
why not everything?
Why not everything? And why do we need consciousness for certain things? What is the extra gloss that consciousness gives, if anything, to our actions?
Right. I'm aware of individual functions of sight. Sometimes I'm aware of a motion, but that motion has no shape, no colour, no depth, no form, no contrast. Sometimes I can tell you what orientation it's at, but then we lose everything else.
So what you lack is the ability to put it all together and to recognise an object, a thing, something with meaning. Well, blind sight is this term introduced by Larry Weisskranz to describe the ability of people like Graham to detect things, but not to be aware of them. So very, very different from what we would normally call vision.
Right.
If there's one thing that this phenomenon of blind sight teaches us, it is that vision is not entirely seeing, that there can be a disconnection from the capacity to respond to visual information and the actual act of being visually aware of something. Those two things can be separated and probably are in our everyday lives. But the problem is that obviously we're not aware of the things that we're not aware of. We just don't know the extent to which they play a part.
It's almost as if the patient is using ESP. He can see and yet cannot see. So it's a paradox. It's almost like science fiction. How is this possible? Well, if you look at the anatomy, you can begin to explain this curious syndrome. It turns out from the eyeball to the higher centers in the brain where you interpret the visual image, there's not just one pathway, there are two separate pathways which subserve different aspects of vision. One of these pathways is the evolutionarily new pathway, the more sophisticated pathway if you like, that goes from the eyeball through the thalamus to the visual cortex of the brain. Now you need the visual cortex for consciously seeing something. The other pathway, which is older evolutionarily, and is more prominent in animals like rodents, lower mammals, birds, and reptiles, goes to the brain stem, the stalk on which the brain sits. And from the brain stem, it gets relayed eventually to the higher centers of the brain. Specifically, the older pathway going through the brainstem is concerned with reflexive behavior, orienting to something important in the visual field, making eye movements, directing your gaze, directing your head towards something important. In these patients, one of these pathways alone is damaged, the visual cortex is damaged. And because that's gone, the patient doesn't see anything consciously. But the other pathway is still intact. And he can use that pathway to guess correctly the direction of movement of an object that he cannot see.
Graham's vision is similar to that of reptiles, who depend on unconscious blind sight for their survival.
A lizard, if it wants to catch a fly, for example, doesn't actually have to see a fly, it doesn't have to recognize a fly, it just has to be aware of something moving. So I suppose me and the lizard are distant cousins.
One of the goals of neuroscience is to understand which parts of the brain are dedicated to what function, how different mental capacities map onto different pathways and different neural circuits in the brain. And surely this fascinating syndrome is going to help us understand not only the nature of seeing, not only the division of labor between these different pathways, but the question of what is consciousness? What does it mean to be consciously aware of something? Why is one pathway alone conscious, whereas the other pathway behaves like a zombie that's trapped inside him, that's unconscious? The syndrome is so strange that when it was initially reported, people didn't believe it, and there are some people who still don't believe it. But in a sense, it's not that strange if you think about it, because in a sense, we experience blind sight all the time in our daily lives. For example, as I am driving this car and having this conversation, all my attention is on the conversation, on the person next to me. And in fact, I'm not conscious of what's going on around me. Even though I'm negotiating all this traffic, avoiding obstacles, avoiding that car on my right, avoiding the car on my left, that's all being done in parallel by another part of my brain, and it never emerges into conscious awareness unless something very strange happens, like a big truck passes by, I might notice it.
Blind sight enables us to steer our way successfully through the world, as if on autopilot.
Now, how are we on the right side? Oops.
Without this zombie in our brains, we'd be swamped by visual information, unable to focus on what really matters.
Okay, so yeah, so that's V.S. Ramachandran, and he is one of the leading neuroscientists of our generation. He's an amazing man, and so he's talking about blind sight, and the fascinating thing that they've learned is about that second neural pathway for our visual system, yeah. And the interesting thing is, he's talking about it being a reflexive pathway, right? It's involuntary. We don't need conscious awareness of the information that it's producing it, because the idea is we're only going to use it for, rapid movement, for sudden, changes in our environment and that kind of thing. And one of the things he said is, we wonder why we have these two different systems, right? And there's a lot of redundancy in the brain. There's a lot of dual pathways and things like that, like we have two hemispheres and so on and so forth. But one of the things that they're talking about, one of the possible theories, is that idea that for involuntary reflexive vision and response, you don't actually want conscious awareness, right? With the idea being that with conscious awareness, we might stop and say and try and figure out what's going on, which would cost us valuable time in responding to whatever's happening, right? So, it's kind of like that startle reflex when, you're walking down a dark hallway and your friend jumps out and scares you. There's a sudden, kind of activation that goes on there, right? And the idea there is, if that was really Michael Myers who jumped out at you, if that was a real threat or that kind of thing, we'd be able to respond faster, rather than, stopping and thinking and saying, okay, this looks like a threat. What should I do about this threat? Well, what kind of a threat is it? All that other stuff, yeah. When we're acting involuntarily, we aren't stopping to gather details, yeah. Something happens, there's a sudden movement, a sudden perception of I'm not safe here, and we respond and we react, yeah. So that's that thing. Sometimes consciousness slows us down, right, is the theory. Yeah, and it's a good thing, obviously, to be slowed down to think about things. But then there's also times when we need to respond. We don't need to think. We don't need to contemplate. How fast is that rock heading towards my head or whatever. You just got to act. You got to move. Yeah. Okay, and that'll do it for this half of the lecture. I want to thank you very much for hanging out with me. You have your discussion question that's due this week, and for that discussion question, I want you to read the article "Psychedelics and the Science of Self-Experience." It's posted in the discussion articles folder on the website. After you read the article, I want you to respond to these 3 questions. Yeah, the first is, how do the authors of the article define the self? What do they say about the self? Right? They sort of talk about 2 different forms of the self. Okay. Second question is, what is the default mode network and what role does it appear to play in consciousness? Okay, they talk about that. Third is, what do the authors say about psychedelic drugs as they relate to consciousness and the self? Yeah, that's the whole sort of point of the article, Psychedelics and the Science of Self-Experience. Yeah. So read the article, respond to these questions. If you have any questions about the article or about this assignment or anything like that, just contact me. I'm happy to discuss it with you. Then your only other requirement for this week is quiz 3, which will be open on Friday, and it's going to be the same thing. It's only going to be on chapters 4 and 5. Yeah, just the material that we covered this week. Okay? All right. And so in the next lecture, we're going to take up and we'll finish the rest of chapter 5. And until then, a hui ho.